everyone today. I don't know if Sonia wants to come back and bring her kitty with her, but it's all ages, so it's for everyone. The title of the story is The Blind Man and the Hunter. And the question that this story asks is, how does a person become wise? Perhaps by hearing a story like this one, which comes from both West Africa and Zimbabwe. In it, we witness two powerful gifts that make the world a better place: insightful thinking and forgiveness. First, there was the wedding, with the caftans and the headdresses, the drumming and the dancing, the singing and the ululating, the stories and the feasting. Later, the new husband asked the bride, "Is your husband truly blind?" "He is, but he moves with such grace and confidence." "He sees with his ears," was her reply. The husband thought about her words. Perhaps they also explained why it was that of all the songs sung and poetry recited at the wedding, the blind man's words seemed the wisest. The husband's claim to fame and source of great pride was his skill at hunting. He went into the bush as often as he could and always came home with supper. His new brother-in-law often asked if he could join him in the hunt, but the husband was reluctant. Perhaps he was worried that it would be dangerous for a blind man. One day, the husband came home with a prized gazelle. There was plenty of meat for the entire village, and it was delicious. After the meal, the blind man asked again whether he could join his brother-in-law in the hunt. With a full and satisfied belly, the husband agreed. The next morning, the brothers-in-law set off down the trail to set traps for birds. The best place to capture a bird was in Janet Asher's backyard. Just kidding. It was a long way off. After they'd been hiking for some time, the blind man suddenly tugged on the hunter's arm and whispered, "There's a lion." "Where?" "A little ahead and to our left, but it's sleeping. We'll be okay." Sure enough, they hadn't gone much farther when the hunter caught a glimpse of a large buff-colored mound expanding and contracting rhythmically. You know what that was, don't you? The mound. It was the lion. Once it safely passed, he asked, "How did you know the lion was there?" The blind man shrugged. "I see with my ears." An hour or so later, they arrived at the place where the hunters suggested placing their traps. He set them out. Had anyone been watching, they might have noticed that he took better care to disguise his own trap than he did of his brother-in-law's. The next day, they headed back down the trail to check the traps. After they'd walked a ways, the blind man tugged at the hunter's arm once again. "There's an elephant." "Where?" demanded the hunter, a little annoyed. "Up ahead and to our right. It's found a water hole. We need not worry." Sure enough, after they'd walked a little further, the hunter could make out a wall of wrinkled gray. You know what the wall of wrinkled gray was, don't you? Mm-hmm. The elephant. Once they'd safely passed it, he asked, "How did you know the elephant was there?" Again, the blind man shrugged. "I see with my ears." They walked on, and even before they had arrived at the traps, the blind man shouted with exuberance, "We've caught some birds." The hunter went to his own trap first. He had caught a small gray bird. He released it from the trap and put it in his pouch. As he approached the blind man's trap, his heart beat faster and his head began to spin with jealousy. The blind man's trap held a dazzling bird whose long tail feathers were a rainbow of colors. Quickly, the hunter grabbed the bird, and with a sleight of hand, he gave the blind man the gray bird and put the rainbow bird in his own pouch. As they walked home, the hunter began to think about his wife's face and how it would light up when he gave her the beautiful bird he had captured. Thinking about his wife caused him to recall their wedding, the dances, the songs, the poetry, and he thought again about the wisdom of his brother-in-law. Suddenly, it occurred to him that here on the trail was his opportunity to learn from this sage. So he said to his brother-in-law, "You're so clever. Tell me why, when there is so much beauty in this world, that there's also hatred and war." It was a few moments before the blind man answered, "Strife and war are caused by the kind of dishonesty and greed that you've just displayed." The hunter gulped. He searched for words to explain his actions, but even the excuse of taking the bird for his wife's sake felt shallow. Instead, he took the rainbow bird out of his pouch and exchanged it for the blind man's gray bird. They walked along some more, and the hunter resumed his questioning. "How is it that war can ever end?" Now the blind man smiled. He said, "Strife disappears and peace returns when people learn from their mistakes and change their ways, just as you have done." The hunter breathed a sigh of relief. They walked home in silence. And after that, whenever anyone asked why the blind man was so wise, his brother-in-law, the hunter, would say, "Because he sees with his ears and hears with his heart." All right, we'll move into the moment of reflective silence, and I have some words to share with you. And after the moment, Janelle will play Spirit of Life, and if you'll join me in singing. They teach us to read in black and white. Truth is this, the rest is false. You are whole or broken. Who you love is acceptable or not. Life tells its truth in many hues. We're taught to think in either or, to believe the teachings of Jesus or Buddha, to believe in human potential or a power beyond a single will. I am broken or I am powerful. Life embraces multiple truths, speaks of both and of and. We're taught to see in absolutes, good versus evil, male versus female, old versus young, gay versus straight. Let us see the fractions, the spectrum, the margins. Let us open our hearts to the complexity of our worlds. Let us make our lives sanctuaries to nurture our many identities. The day is coming when all will know that the rainbow world is more gorgeous than monochrome, that a river of identities can ebb and flow over the static, stubborn rocks in its course, that the margins hold the center.
Sing in my heart, all this earth
where'd I go?
Let's try this again.
That's okay.
Yeah.
I want to make sure that everyone can hear me speak. So please don't be shy if at any time I start to drift. I know a lot of times people say my voice is too soft. I'll do my best. What I'm going to try to do here today, the theme of inherent worth and dignity, I'm coordinating the talks for this month, and I didn't get a chance to introduce the topic. Last week, Bill and I were away at a family wedding, but I heard that Mary did an excellent job of opening for us. Mary, I applaud you. I know you're out there. So I will do a brief intro, and then I will go into the sermon that was prepared by Reverend Dr. Weinstein that I'll be using. So on the theme of inherent worth and dignity, I have long thought that most social problems could be resolved or at least managed if everyone fully embraced our first principle. And big surprise, Unitarians are not alone in that sentiment. I recently learned that the Social Workers Code of Ethics begins with, "We believe in the inherent dignity and worth of all men." Didn't include women or children, but you get it. The Code of Ethics doesn't end there. It goes on to say a lot of good things about social responsibility and justice and the commitment of social workers to the well-being of those they serve, even addressing activism. I found it interesting that one of the statements in the code is, "We believe in free men freely living in a free society where poverty is neither a fate or a punishment, but is a condition that can and must be changed." And there's a little organization named the United Nations that was founded after the end of World War II. The United Nations begins its charter with the words, "We, the people of the United States, determined to have," of the United Nations, "determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and to reaffirm in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, and the equal rights of men and women, and of nations large and small, and to establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other resources of international law can be maintained, and to promote social progress and better standards of life and larger freedom." These were people that had endured the atrocities of World War II and were determined that the world would never allow that to happen again. So United Nations formed right after World War II. And then the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, drafted with care by a group of diverse people who were led by Eleanor Roosevelt and proclaimed by the UN General Assembly in 1948, begins, "Whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world." Further, in the preamble to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, again reference is made. "Whereas the peoples of the United Nations have in the Charter reaffirmed their faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, and in the equal rights of men and women, and have determined to promote social progress and better standards of life and larger freedom." The declaration goes on to outline 30 articles addressing slavery, gender equality, equal pay for equal work, the right to vacation, the right to nationality, rights of children, marriage rights, access to a fair trial, among many other rights and protections. The Declaration has inspired over 80 legally binding treaties and has been the foundation for many human rights laws. These are ways in which two groups with a common inspiration and determination affirmed their missions in a big way. One within their profession, the social workers and people they serve, and another with an arguably bigger world vision. It can be easier to commit yourself to a cause, feeding from the energy of others united in a common vision. But equally important is how we put our belief in the inherent dignity and worth of others in our neighborhoods, when traveling, in our relationships, in the workplace, in our dealing with strangers, acquaintances, and with those who we know well. Bill and I had the great good fortune last weekend to spend an hour and a half in line at a car rental business in Detroit on a recent trip. An hour and a half, waiting our turn at the counter to pick up the vehicle we had reserved. I easily slipped into people watching and making unwarranted assumptions about the probably 50 plus people waiting in line within the building. The line continued outside. The stickers on the floor encouraging 6 feet of distancing between customers impotently stared up at us all, who were just standing 6 inches apart at the most. People were pretty good about being masked up, except the guy in front of us, who I was giving my best inner stink eye. Outside, I observed a young, thin, tall woman who seemed to be half-heartedly tending to her children while taking selfies, sporting slightly surprised smiles and showing no hint of the young children on the other side of her cell phone or of the steaming mass of humanity on the inside of the building, packed in the tiny building like sardines. Surprisingly, though, we all politely maintained order. 2 entrances into the building created a little confusion about where the line actually started. But if anyone tried to join the line from the wrong door, someone would courteously point out the origin of the line and the people would compliantly walk to the start. We were all equal in that line. And it was a pretty ethnically diverse group. No one was angry. The employees brought out 2 big coolers on wheels, one holding water bottles on ice, one without ice packed with snacks. People in line passed them along to others, all smiling and bantering in friendly tones. The employees behind the counter all greeted each person with their full attention as they tended their customers' individual situations. We struck up a conversation with the maskless man ahead of us, the one I was given the inner stink eye. He was very friendly and talked a lot about his kids. The selfie woman outside the building came in, taking her young sons to the bathroom. The older boy ran to his daddy and jumped up into his arms, who was the maskless man, who enthusiastically picked up his young son. These were good people. They loved their kids and their kids loved them. We also struck up a conversation with a woman in line behind us. We were both headed to weddings. Bill showed her photos from his recent solo backpack trip to the Bighorns, and she showed us photos of her recent family vacation, rafting the Colorado River in the Grand Canyon. She was from Jersey, and she sounded like it. We talked about kids, vacation, what brought us to the budget rental car line. Funnily enough, we met our new friend from Jersey later on a shuttle to the airport when we went to return our card. And we talked a bit about how our trips had gone. If only we could always find it in us to allow our assumptions to melt away, listen, and appreciate the good we see in each other. I know that even though I know all this and try to follow, and am part of a community right here that keeps this principle in the forefront of what we believe, Some situations are more difficult than others. I need reminders, and I need to keep at it. Oh, and that car that we rented, it turns out the model was a Soul. I like to think of how I left that experience at the Detroit airport with a Soul. And it was too bad that I had to take it back. All right, now I will move into the words of Reverend Dr. Victoria Weinstein. The title of her sermon is Practicing Inherent Worth and Dignity, Keeping It Real with the First Principle. I made myself look up Reverend Weinstein just to get a sense of who she was as a person. And I was very pleasantly surprised. Reverend Dr. Weinstein was raised Unitarian. Her parents came to Unitarianism because her father was a secular Jew. Her mother was raised Greek Orthodox, I believe. And when they wanted to get married, the minister would not allow a service to a marriage to a Jew. So he refused to do the service. So the couple sought and discovered Unitarian Universalism. And they later decided that they wanted to raise their children that way. So she was raised Unitarian. At the beginning of her career, she was a teacher, and she worked in a pretty tough neighborhood outside or in Chicago. Her students called her preacher lady because she was always encouraging them to live up to their potential despite what others thought of them. She has been described as someone with enormous leadership skill, unbelievable preaching ability, a warm and wonderful sense of humor. Her mother thinks of her as Bette Midler behind the pulpit. And I did see a picture of her. She is this larger than life person and has red hair. She got her degree, her master's from Harvard Divinity School at 31. The age of 31, I had my first child. And then she went on to get her doctorate of divinity, and she is still part of a congregation. I can't remember where it is. I believe it's, oh yeah, the UU Church of Greater Lynn in Massachusetts. So switch gears into the words of Reverend Victoria Weinstein that was delivered in 2007. So it was a while ago. I saw a movie a few years ago that I can't get out of my mind. It's called Monster, and it's the true story of Eileen Wuornos, a serial killer who was executed by the state of Florida in 2002. The entire movie is incredibly haunting and disturbing, but there's one scene that I especially can't forget. It's near the beginning of the film when Eileen is struggling to get her life back after being a drug addict and prostitute. She's met someone and fallen in love and wants very badly to start her life over again and to set it in a positive direction. So she gets herself all put together in the best clothes that she has and knows how to put herself together. And they're definitely not very professional looking, and goes in for a job interview at a law firm. She's full of bravado, and although she obviously doesn't have the experience or the skills to do the job, she's all ready to bluff her way through the interview. You can see how badly she wants a chance, and you really root for her to get her off the merry-go-round of violence and criminal life. Even though you know how this tragic story ends, you can't help hoping that something will turn out for the better for her. The man interviewing Eileen barely hides his contempt and disdain for her. He asks her a few questions, which she fields pretty well, but again, you can tell she has no experience or skills suitable for the job. And then in the most sneering way possible, this guy says something like this to her. You've got a lot of nerve. You must be kidding me, coming in here with no experience, no abilities, nothing to offer, no education. And he just lays into her. And the worst thing is that he looks like he really enjoys humiliating her. This movie is full of sadistic characters like this, people who get their jollies treating this woman like scum. Eileen sits there, and her face is just a mess of pain and shame and disgust for the man and for herself too. And she walks out of there and gets drunk or high. And I think it's pretty soon after that she commits her first murder against a man who brutalizes her. The story is this horrific sleigh ride after that interview, a bad, out of control downhill skid, and I can't get it out of my head. Because what would have happened if that one man had said, you know what, Eileen? You've got a lot of nerve coming in here, unqualified and inexperienced, but I like that in a person. Let's not kid ourselves. I can't give you this job, but why don't you tell me what kind of things you think you can do? And I'll see if I know someone who might be able to hire you in some capacity. For me, that's the Unitarian Universalist first principle right there. The inherent worth and dignity of every person. On paper, it looks like a nice motto. You can see it and the other 6 principles on the front page of your hymnals. Take a look. Let me give you some background before we get back to Monster. The Unitarians and Universalists were 2 small denominations that merged in 1961. They both had a fascinating story separately. Unitarianism was a movement that emphasized the freedom of conscience, the use of the intellect, and discerning religious truth, and the dignity of each human personality. And Universalism was a movement that preached the everlasting love and benevolence of God and the salvation of each soul. Both denominations had their heyday in the 19th century as liberal Christian denominations, but by the end of that century, each had moved theologically farther and farther away from traditional Christianity. When the 2 traditions merged to become UUism in 1961, both movements had embraced appreciation for other world religions, free thought, and a commitment to religious humanism. Methodist Bishop William Willimon once remarked that there's never been a merger of any religious traditions that didn't weaken both, rather than strengthen them. If you study religious mergers at all, you can see what he means. Hybrid, hyphenated religious traditions, and America is full of them. The United Church of Christ and the United Methodist Church being 2 that immediately come to mind, are a complicated phenomenon, bringing together not just theological traditions, but different cultures of church governance, different ways and understandings of what it means to be church, and vastly different ideas about the role of the ordained clergy. Unitarian Universalism, born in the year my parents were married, is no different. Because it involved this joining of 2 non-creedal denominations, that is, 2 denominations that did not require a statement of faith from its members, even though the Universalists often shared professions or confessions of theological belief. It was, and still is, a serious challenge to articulate what this religion is all about. You know how this goes yourself if you've been a church-going Unitarian Universalist for any significant period of time. And you get that inevitable question, what do you people believe? Here on this page containing the principles is part of how you may choose to formulate your response. You can start by saying, well, for one thing, we affirm the inherent worth and dignity of every person. It's a fine phrase, amended to its final form by the General Assembly of the UUA in 1985. Interesting enough, this is my sidebar, not her words, but that's nearly 4 decades after the UN General Assembly professed the same idea. Did I say 4 decades? That's what I meant. And it's as good a place to start as any in the articulation of what we're trying to do to be together. The inherent worth and dignity of every person. What do we mean by inherent? We mean that every human being is born with a value to them, that each life matters, and that no one is born with more potential to inspire, heal, or harm the world than any other. Equal start, inherently, God-given. As far as I'm concerned, this ties us together with the rest of the world's people, many of whom are treated as though they're indispensable. They are dispensable, throwaway creatures. I've been reading about the war in Sudan, Africa lately, and I think, you know, as an American woman, I have such a keen sense of the preciousness of my own life. I've been raised since birth to think of myself as so special. I live in a culture that treats every mishap, accident, cancer diagnosis, and natural disaster that affects me and people like me as an enormous tragedy. What I learned from this is that my life is so valuable. It's terrible when something unfortunate happens to me or someone like me. If I or a member of my congregation got shot or killed in a bombing, it would make the front page of the local Mariner. That's their newspaper. And yet I live in a world where hundreds of thousands of children, no less loved by their parents, no less inherently special and precious, are wasting away in refugee camps in sub-Saharan Africa, not to mention other places of conflict in the world. If I believe in our first principle, I can't walk past this. I cannot be sickened by this because to allow it makes the claim that some people, I cannot not be sickened by this because to allow it makes the claim that some people have worth and dignity, but not all of us. To embrace the UU first principle is a way of being in relationship with the world. As Sarah Lammert points out in her essay on the subject, it has been the tendency of some Unitarian Universalists to make this principle a celebration of individualism and to use it to support, in her words, a defensive arrogance about our particular point of view. I know what she's talking about. I've seen it in our congregations. You can't tell me what to do. I've got inherent worth and dignity. But that's a misunderstanding of the whole point of the thing, which is to draw us, I think, into a really humble awareness of those whose voices are not heard, whose presence has historically not been welcome, who are forgotten and devalued. When I think of this principle, I think of my favorite poem by Mary Oliver, where she says that she looks upon everything as a sisterhood and a brotherhood, and each life as a flower, and each name a comfortable music in the mouth, and each body a lion of courage and something precious to the earth. Each body a lion of courage and precious to the earth. Oh, isn't that something to live up to? Did you see the recent article that Deanna Riley's daughter wrote in our newsletter, where she describes how worried she was for her mother getting involved in prison ministry, mentoring a man named Wayne Boston, a student in the Prison Behind Bars program? At first, Elizabeth thought of Wayne as some convict and refused to let Deanna, her mother, bring a photo of her and her husband to share with him in prison. Absolutely not, she said. I don't want some convict having my picture. Eventually, Elizabeth decided she would rack up some good karma by writing to Wayne. She and her husband thought it would be wise to get a post office box because they didn't want a convicted criminal to know where they live. But out of laziness, Elizabeth writes, she never did get that P.O. box, and eventually she found that she has no need for one. She wrote, 2 years ago, we wanted to hide from Wayne. 7 years from now, when he's finished serving his sentence, I will open my front door and see a friend. Here's a perfect example of being drawn into the relational implications of being willing to believe in the inherent worth and dignity of every person. All right. As you well know by now, our societies are set up in such a way as to dazzle our eyes with the illusion that some people are good and worthy and others don't make it on that list. Naively, we walk around actually thinking we know which is which. People who hear of our first principle ask, well, what about Hitler? What about Idi Amin? How about Osama bin Laden? Do they have inherent worth and dignity? I answer that I believe that they, like every person, were born with inherent innate value, and that they chose to violate the human covenant so egregiously that I consider them to have negative worth and no remaining dignity. To be a Unitarian Universalist does not mean that we're not allowed to make value judgments. This is the tricky part. And that we have to affirm the inherent worth and dignity of every idea or behavior. As my colleague Meg Barnhouse says in her wonderful South Carolina accent, I don't have to affirm the inherent worth and dignity of every idea, because some ideas are dumb. Evil and badness do exist. I don't know if they're genetically programmed or socially induced or brought about by frontal lobe damage or what. I just know, and so do you, that not all people have made good on that original worth they were born with. Not even necessarily when they're given that job or treated with respect. I'm not trying to sugarcoat this, but why ask about Idi Amin when really our biggest struggle is with the obnoxious next door neighbor, the teacher we think is being unfair to our child, the condescending coworker who steals our ideas and takes credit for it, the family member who talks trash about us behind our backs, the Blue Cross Blue Shield caseworker who keeps losing our file. The challenge is there, isn't it? The challenge is navigating through the people we meet. The job applicant sitting in front of us with the broken teeth and the heroin tracks on her arms. The prisoner who wants to write to her mother. The Latino immigrant who got the job your son wanted. The friend who keeps sending you those incendiary political emails that make your blood boil. What a challenge to be in the presence of that person and to remember that they are a lion of courage and precious to the earth. Not to be sentimental and gooey about the fact, but to live into what it demands of us. Human presence, basic respect, nonviolence, an audit of our own feelings of superiority. Some will be good, some will be bad. What they choose to do is their business. How I am present to them is mine. I'm not really that interested in whether or not Idi Amin, Osama bin Laden, or Hitler have inherent worth and dignity. They've done their damage and we can't change it. We can only change ourselves and try to develop such a strong ethical heart that even if we were dying of hunger or thirst and everything we love threatened with extinction, we would still not be attracted to those philosophies. To make our first principle into a spiritual practice requires us to honestly acknowledge that we have been programmed by our society to treasure and cherish certain kinds of people over others, and to see only a select few as bearing as much worth, value, and dignity as we ourselves have. The rest we have been trained by many forces to regard as other. We're either afraid of that other, or we feel superior to that other, or almost as bad. We've learned to feel a kind of privileged pity or charity towards those others. And please God, spare us from that latter, perhaps most of all. What if Eileen Wuornos had had an interview that fateful day with a kind-hearted liberal man or woman who said to her, "Oh yes, I know all about the life you've led. Prostitution and drug addiction are so degrading and unhealthy. You must have been abused in your childhood to make you turn to such options. It's a shame you didn't stay in school and get an education and make professional contacts. I really affirm your worth and dignity, but I have nothing for you. There's the door. Thanks for stopping by." It would not be enough. It's not enough for this religious tradition or any other to simply try to have the right virtuous thoughts and feelings. Something more is asked of us, and the name for that something more is love. That enormous, demanding, divine idea that asks us not only to feel virtuous things, but to shape our actions around those feelings. The poet Rilke says that human love consists in this, that two solitudes protect and border and greet each other. Isn't that beautiful? It gives us a clear idea of what we are supposed to do, not just to feel. We are to protect and border and greet each other. The Hindus have a beautiful word for this idea. Namaste, they say. It means the divine in me greets the divine in you. The inherent worth and dignity in me greets the inherent worth and dignity in you, whoever you are. That's the essence of our first Unitarian Universalist principle. There are 6 more, but we'll leave those for other Sunday mornings. Trying to embrace the spirit of Namaste is certainly enough for this morning and probably for a lifetime.
Namaste.
Namaste. Okay, moving right there.
121.
The hymn is 1021 from the Aqua Hymnal, and I believe that Janet had put the words for that in the email that went out to the congregation.